I'll give you a little introduction. Yep. You're off to the races. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. And we are looking forward to hosting you. My name is Emily Krupczewski. I'm the site manager here. Not present, but always influential is Brent Peterson. He's our executive director. So we welcome all of you guys. The Heritage Center is open from Tuesday through Sunday. We're closed on Mondays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. are our hours. So if you want to stop back and visit us, you're more than welcome. We also have the Warden's House Museum. Ask the guy in the red shirt, not this one, the other one, about that. We are open for tours there Thursday through Sunday. And then we also have Hay Lake School as well. You can find all that information at the front desk or on our website. You can also see all of our upcoming events on our website as well. We're very much looking forward to this one. And next week, we have another one. Gary Goodman is going to be presenting next Tuesday on The Last Bookseller. It's his new book, and it's about the used and rare book trade, including stories about his store, St. Croix Antiquarian Booksellers. So some of you may remember shopping there. He's going to be here talking about that. And of course, tonight we have Mark Labine. I'm saying that right. It's fine. Okay. Okay. Mark is a descendant of Joseph and Isaac. Help me with the last name. There we go. That's why he takes French. Who were two of the 8 builders who built the St. Paul Chapel. So a very personal story to him. They were some of the first pioneers who settled in Minnesota. And he is a member of the French American Heritage Foundation. They have a lot of really, really interesting things going on and a lot of hard work being done through there. So be sure to check them out as well. So without further ado, here's Mark.
So it is said that God is infinite, that God has no beginning, no end. But that's not true for the city of St. Paul. The city of St. Paul, the modern city of St. Paul, did in fact have a beginning. And in the beginning, there was a chapel. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Labine, and Labine, as you wait. I'm a member of the French American Heritage Foundation, and we like to do history, and we're kind of all history nuts. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the St. Paul Chapel. It's a great little story about the beginning of St. Paul, and I'm going to basically start out by kind of setting the scene. You know, what was going on here? The chapel was built in 1841. I'm going to talk about, you know, what was going on here in 1841. And I'm going to talk about the construction of the chapel, who did it, who participated in building this little chapel, and then its legacy, because this little St. Paul Chapel has a great story. It's a great legacy, and it's a fun story for me to tell. I do want to give special thanks to Richard Paul Moudry, who in 1950 wrote a dissertation for his PhD titled The Chapel of St. Paul, the Beginnings of Catholicity in St. Paul, 1840-1851. He did a lot of research in his dissertation, and it was a great resource for me. I have written a book in the back for people who are interested after. If you want to get more information, I'm selling the books for $15. It's not actually my book. It's all the proceeds go to the French American Heritage Foundation, and we do history projects and do stories and do events like this. So if anybody's interested after, you're more than welcome to purchase the book. So let's talk about, you know, setting the scene. So, you know, anytime you talk about anything in Minnesota, you've got to remember the fact that, you know, the Europeans came later, and that people had been living here for a long time, thousands of years. Archaeologists believe that these burial mounds in Minnesota, there was over 12,500 documented, and there's probably many thousands more that were not documented. They've been here for thousands of years, probably 2,000 at least. They've discovered remains of a human being that lived here over 9,000 years ago. So we don't know how long human beings lived in this area and lived in the St. Paul area, but we know it's been a long time, probably thousands of years. But the Europeans didn't come until a little bit later. The first known Europeans in Minnesota that we know about were a couple of French coureurs de bois named Grossier and Radisson, and they were here, documented here in 1659. That's the first known Europeans in Minnesota. In 1689, this guy named Nicholas Perrot, who was a representative of the King of France, on the shores of Lake Pepin, declared that all this land, including Minnesota, belonged to the King of France. So from 1689 to 1803, France had territorial claims to the Minnesota, and so did Spain for a while. But we all know what happened in 1803. Napoleon in France sold the land, including Minnesota, to the United States for 3 cents an acre. Pretty good deal. And after that sale, the Americans came. And in 1805, a guy named Zebulon Pike, might have heard that name. Pikes Peak in Colorado was named after him. But he came up here in an expedition. He was supposed to scout out this new area that the Americans had bought from France. And he determined an area, a good place to build a fort. And he determined that a great place to build a military fort would be at where the waters meet. And there's a book back there called Where the Waters Meet. And it's about this area where the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River meet. And that's where Fort Snelling is. And it's a beautiful location. Go from the picture. But that was the beginning of the first settlement in Minnesota. In 1819, a guy named Leavenworth came up here. Colonel Henry Leavenworth, he came up here with some troops, some army troops, and they started building the fort. And before he built the fort, he entered into a treaty with the local Dakota, mostly Dakota, for about a 6,000 acre military reservation. And this is what the military reservation, you can kind of see the size. You can see that it included most of Minneapolis, St. Anthony Falls, pretty large area, about 6,000 acres. Meanwhile, up north, 1812, this guy named Thomas Douglas, 5th Earl of Selkirk from Scotland, was really wanted to do something for his Scottish people, and he was trying to set up a settlement up in the Winnipeg area. And he purchased land, and he got rights to this land, and he started the settlement. First settlers came in 1812, but a lot of problems with this Selkirk colony. A lot of problems. First, the War of 1812 changed the boundary lines, so right away he lost half of his territory because now the United States had a claim to it. They were fighting up there. The fur trade companies were at war. The Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company were at odds with each other. There was actually a battle where 21 men were killed. They had grasshoppers up there. They had floods. And I don't know if any of you have ever been up to Winnipeg, but it's cold. It's really cold up there. So they had problems. Now, in 1821, they're building a fort down here, and there's a few fur traders and whatnot in Prairie du Chien. And a bunch of these French Canadians, Alexis Bailey, if you've ever been to Bailey Vineyard, he was one of these guys, and Roulette, Joseph Roulette, these guys decided, these Selkirk people up there need cattle. So in 1821, they did a cattle drive. If you can believe it, they herded a bunch of cattle through Minnesota. Roads or anything. It was really unbelievable. From Prairie du Chien to Winnipeg, they herded like 200 cattle, 250 cattle. And they got up to the Selkirk colony. But I think what happened when they got up to the Selkirk colony, the Selkirk people realized, hey, there's civilization down there. It's not that far. And let's go back with these guys because we don't like it up here. So in 1821, 5 families came back with these cattle drive guys. And then they kept coming. In 1823, 13 families came. And by 1835, over 500 people had come from the Selkirk colony, and they were coming from the north. Now you think that Minnesota would have been settled by people that came from the east or the south, but that's not true. They came from the north. The first settlers in Minnesota came from the north, the Selkirk colony. And this is a map drawn in 1837. And it's the reservation area, but it shows where all these Selkirk colonists were living because the commander of the fort, Josiah Snelling, said, okay, I got 6,000 acres, that I had a treaty with Dakota. You can stay on my reservation. He said it was okay. So they started, and the word got out, and they came down and they started a community. It was called Camp Stillwater, and they had stores, and they were building barns and houses, and they had cattle, and they were going to settle there. They were all set, and it was okay with Snelling for the time being. Meanwhile, 1837, and this affects Stillwater too because things changed. But in 1837, the United States government entered into a treaty with the Dakota and the Ojibwe. And I just put some of the information on the treaty because these treaties, when you look at these treaties that the U.S. made, they're all kind of similar, but the 2 tribes got $40,000 cash. They didn't really get the cash. They were more interested in goods because they didn't have a banking system. The tribes didn't have banks, but they got $40,000 worth of goods, basically what they got. The fur traders and the mixed bloods got $370,000. And you see that a lot of these treaties. The fur traders really were did very well with these treaties. They always got a lot of pay. They made claims at the Dakota and the Ojibwe owed them money. But this was a treaty, 1837. And you can see the red area where that was all area now that belonged to the United States of America. And it was basically all this land that was east of the Mississippi River. So after this treaty, while Isaiah Snelling is gone, he's not the commander anymore. We got a new commander at Fort Snelling. His name is Joseph Plimpton. And he decides that he doesn't want these Selkirk people on his reservation anymore. And he says, you know, you got a place to go now. You can go over east of the Mississippi because we got a treaty. I want you to go over there. So he evicted them. You know, they were using up too much wood. You know, wood was a problem because there was only so much wood. You know, they were selling whiskey to the soldiers, plus the young girls. The young girls were kind of a distraction, so he wanted them off the reservation. So he kicked them out. And where did they go? Well, most of them went to a place called Pig's Eye. There was an area known as Pig's Eye. Why was it called Pig's Eye? Because there's this guy named Pig's Eye Prawn who had a little tavern there, and he sold liquor to the Indians and to the soldiers and whatnot. And people just started calling it, well, that's Pig's Eye's town or whatever. So these people that were evicted from the reservation a lot of them came to the area around downtown St. Paul. And 1840, you know, shortly after the eviction, what we got in Minnesota at that time, we got about 180 people who lived in St. Peter's, which is Mendota. And there was a small little house there. And most of these people were French Canadian. There were some Scottish people, you know, a few English or whatever, but most of them were French Canadian, and most of the French Canadians were Catholic. So in St. Peter's, there was about 180 of them, and they had this little chapel. They used this picture here. Hopefully you can see it. There's a little cabin there that was Faribault's first original house, and they were using that as a church over in Mendota. They call it St. Peter, Chapel of St. Peter. Meanwhile, over in Pig's Eye area, you know, which is where current downtown St. Paul is, in 1840, there were about 13 to 19 families who were living there. About 150 people. Most of them were French Canadian, but there was a black man named James Thompson. There were 3 ex-soldiers, William Evans, who was an Irishman, and Ed Phelan and John Hayes. They were both English. And of course, a number of the French Canadians had Native American wives. Now, the bishop of Iowa, his name was Loras. He actually his family were a noble family in France, and most of them got killed during the French Revolution. But he was over in Iowa, and he decided, well, there's enough Catholics now in Minnesota that we need to send some missionaries. So he sent a couple of priests, and one of them was named Lucien Gaultier. Sometimes it's pronounced Gaultier, but Gaultier is probably the French pronunciation. And he came down to check out, and he, you know, checked out St. Peter's. They had a little place there for a chapel. But then he came over to Pig's Eye area, and he realized, you know, they got no place to say mass here. And so it's kind of a long ways to go from downtown St. Paul area over to St. Peter, Mendota. So he figured, well, we need to find a place to build you a little chapel, a little church. 1841, this is approximately who was living in the St. Paul area. And this information I got from an article written that was published in the St. Paul Dispatch. It was basically an interview of Isaac Labissoniere. He was a kind of a talker. He was saying, here's where everybody was living. So you can kind of see who was living in St. Paul at the time in 1841. This is the year that the chapel was built. And you can see I put where the little chapel is kind of up in the upper left there. And then you can see where all these French Canadians mostly were living, kind of surrounded Pig's Eye Front, and moved down the Pig's Eye Lake. And you had Peter Campbell and Michael Leclerc. Michael Leclerc and Pierre Pig's Eye Front were fighting over what areas they had. But you got to understand that all these people were there. This is 1841. They all were making claims. But you could not own land. It wasn't legally yours until the government sold it to you. And you couldn't buy land from the government until it was surveyed. And the first survey in Minnesota was 1848. So in 1841, none of these people legally owned this land, but they had claims. And they respected each other's claims for the most part, but not always. Like I said, Michael Leclerc and Pig's Eye Front got in a big fight over what land they had and what they didn't have. So they fight over that. But this is basically who was living in St. Paul in 1841. And here's a kind of a Google map. You kind of get an idea of what it looks like. And this was a painting drawn in 1846 by a guy named Seth Eastman. He was a military officer over at Fort Snelling, and he really has some really great paintings of Minnesota in the 1840s. And this kind of gives you an idea of what their habitation and what their buildings look like in 1841. I think it's probably pretty similar. I mean, this could have been in the St. Paul area, for all you know. So let's talk about 1841. So Father Gautier meets with these local pioneers, settlers, and they decide, they look at a couple places where they're going to build a chapel. And they look at down in the low, let me go back to this map here. They look kind of down here by the Mississippi River, Peter Gamel's and Michael Clare's area, and they said, no, it floods too much. That's not a good spot. And then they looked up on the bluffs there. Charles Rousseau had a place up there. And he said, I'll give you some land. You can have my claim. But Father Gautier said, that's too high. It's too high up. I don't like that area. So Ben Jarvis or Gervais and Vital Guerin owned some land over in this area here where the chapel is. And Gautier said, that's a good spot to build a chapel. It's high enough. It's close to the river. It's a perfect spot to build a chapel. So they decided that's where they're going to build the chapel. Now, we know that there were 8 men who built this chapel. And here's who they are. And I want to talk to you a little bit about each one of them. And there's a memorial on the Kellogg Bluffs, downtown St. Paul and Kellogg and Minnesota Street. And this little plaque is there. And one of the reasons why I know that these are the 8 guys, because the 8 names are listed on this plaque, the memorial. And that's a symbol of an axe, because they took their axes and they chopped the wood and they built the chapel. But of course, there were other people that helped build the chapel. I don't want them to be forgotten either. So we're going to talk a little bit about who these other men were. But let's not forget the women, because we know that there were women who were involved and who helped. And these are some of the wives of some of the men who built. The women were making the food probably, and they were there. They were support. Their names don't show up anywhere, but we know that the women were there and they were supporting this venture. So let's talk about who these 8. Let's talk about the 8 builders. A little bit about who built this chapel, the St. Paul Chapel, in 1841. First of all, we have Charles Botneau. He was married to Francois Louise Parenteau. He was living downtown St. Paul with his brother Pierre for a time. He ended up moving down to Campbell, North Dakota, and he had a farm down there. It said that he took James J. Hill by ox cart from Campbell to St. Paul once. That's one of his claims to fame. He died in 1905 in Washington, D.C. at his nephew John Baptiste Botneau's home. So he was one of these original 8 builders of this chapel. Pierre Botneau was another builder. Pierre Botneau was the guy that he became famous. And he was sometimes called the Kit Carson of the Midwest. He did a lot of things. He was involved in a lot of ventures. He was involved in St. Anthony. He built the chapel of St. Paul. He was involved in settling Osseo, one of the first settlers there. He was in Breckenridge, Washington, Red Lake Falls. He was a guide that people would hire him to guide them around the area. He was an Indian scout for Sibley during the U.S. World War of 1862. Very, very active man. There's his house, Botneau House, is currently located at the Elm Creek Park Reserve over in Maple Grove. There are a number of things named after him. There's Botneau Boulevard in Hennepin County. There's Botneau County in North Dakota. There's Botneau Park over in Minneapolis, Botneau Library in Minneapolis. He achieved the name, and people remember who he was. And he was one of the builders of the St. Paul Chapel.
Is that home open on a tour though?
What's that?
Is that home open?
It is open at certain times. Yeah, they have a Maple Grove Historical Society, and they do stuff there every now and then. It's not open all the time. You have to kind of check on them, but it is open, yes. Now, 2 of the other builders were Pierre Gervais or Jarvis. I think a lot of people say Jarvis, but Gervais, I'd say would be the pronunciation, right? And it's got 2 Pierres, and I think one of them was I call Pierre the Elder, and one was Louis Pierre the Younger. And this is a drawing of Louis Pierre the Younger with his wife Marie Tremblay. I have no picture. You know, a lot of some of these people we just don't have pictures of. They were early settlers. They lived downtown St. Paul. They had a claim down there. They ended up moving out to Osseo. And here's their gravestones out in the Osseo Cemetery where they settled and died. Philo Guerin was one of the men who gave part of his claim to the church. Of course, like they said, it was a claim at the time, but you know, all these guys downtown St. Paul were making claims, and it wasn't surveyed to 1848. And in 1849, they had an auction because, you know, people had been living there for 10 years, and now the government was ready to sell the land. So they said, well, we're going to have an auction. Highest bidder, whoever bids the highest, can have this land. So these guys all showed up at the auction. They had Sibley come with them because he was kind of their spokesperson. And they all showed up at this auction. And I think the auction was at Stillwater or somewhere. It was Wisconsin Territory still then. And they all showed up at the auction with their clubs. Anybody that dared or had any idea that they're going to bid against them that was going to see the club. And they all had their club. They call it the club auction. As it turned out, nobody bid against them. I don't know why, but so they all were able to file their claim, and they all got their land patents for the claims that they made. There were a few disputes, but for the most part, they agreed on who was going to get what. And so they eventually got title of land, and that's when the church actually got title to the property that Philo Guerin and Ben Gervais had given to the church for this chapel. Here's a picture of Philo Guerin's house in 1852. He was one of the people that stayed downtown St. Paul, and in 1852 or 4 or whatever, he sold his claim for $100,000, which was like millions of dollars today. He became a very wealthy man because he stayed downtown and was there when it became a boom town, and he made a lot of money. Not everybody stayed downtown. The Gervais left. And here's Joseph Labissoniere. He's my 4th great grandfather. I know a lot about Joseph Labissoniere because, you know, he's part of my family, but this is a baptism in April of 1841, where he had his child baptized by Lucien Gaultier, and there's Gaultier's signature on his baptism certificate. So he had a child born just before they built the chapel. They built the chapel in October of 1841. Joseph Labissoniere was born in Quebec, and he was hired as a carpenter. He went to the Selkirk colony. He was in the Selkirk colony for a while. He was hired as a fur trader. He was in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and he was also in Turtle River, North Dakota. He came down in 1837 in an ox cart with 30 other people. They all came down because he was part of the Selkirk migration. Came to St. Paul, was hired as a boatman for Louis Provencal, who was one of the fur traders, and he worked as a fur trader, and he made a claim down by the fish hatchery. Also made a claim downtown St. Paul, and then after the chapel was built, he moved out and he made a claim on Lake Como. So he owned about 100. Him and Margaret was his daughter, and Isaac was his son. The 3 of them owned basically where Como Park is today. They got a land patent. They were the first owners of Como Park. And then eventually they moved out to Osseo. Isaac was his son. He was only 18 years old at the time that the chapel was built. A lot of what we know about the chapel was based upon interviews with Isaac. There's a number of articles, newspaper articles, interviews with Isaac Labissoniere. Here are some notes by a reporter who was talking to Isaac about the chapel, going into detail about how long it took, what they built. It took them 7 days to build this chapel of St. Paul. Like I said, they got a lot of people volunteered and donated stuff to the chapel. They said the total cost was $65 for all the expenses and whatnot to build the chapel. And he kind of goes into some of the detail about the chapel. Isaac Labissoniere's house is still standing, believe it or not, in Osseo. After he made the claim on where Como Park is today, he sold it and he moved out to Osseo and he made a claim out there, and that's where he lived until his 1902 is when he became sick and he moved back to St. Paul with his daughter. Another one of the builders was a guy named Francois Morin. We don't know much about him. I don't know if he was ever married. There's a Francois Morin buried at the St. John's Little Canada Cemetery, but it's not real clear if that's the same one or not. It could be. Chances are it is, but I don't know a lot about Francois Morin. But he was around and he was doing work every now and then. His name shows up. He was part of building Sibley's house, and his name shows up occasionally, but not a lot. Those are the 8 builders. Now, who else built this St. Paul Chapel, or was part of it? It's a guy named Benjamin Gervais. He wasn't a builder, but he donated the land. Him and Violet Guerin donated the land for the chapel. He was one of the people who made the donation. And this is him and his wife. Not sure what year this is, but later on in his life. He moved out to Little Canada, and he got a lot of things named after him. There's Lake Jarvis, there's a street named after him. He was one of the first settlers of Little Canada. He started the grist mill. There's a plaque for him out there. So he was one of the early pioneers and starters of Little Canada, Minnesota. Some other people who helped with the chapel: Scott Campbell, James Cluett, and William Evans. A guy named Auguste Larpenteur Avenue in St. Paul is named after this guy. But he said that these 3 guys helped and they made a contribution, but we don't really know what they did. But they're mentioned as helpers or contributors to the building of the chapel. Scott Campbell was an interpreter, worked at Fort Snelling. He lived downtown St. Paul for a while. We're not sure what he did. But James Cluett was born in England. He worked as an agent for the American Fur Trade Company. He married a guy named Abraham Pierre's daughter, Rose, and he purchased, I know him because he purchased Joseph Labissoniere's claim in downtown for a horse. He paid a horse for the claim when Joseph Labissoniere got tired of being downtown St. Paul. William Evans was living there at the time, and supposedly he did something to help. He was a soldier at Fort Snelling, and William Evans was part of a group of 3 soldiers: William Evans, Edward Phelan, and John Hayes, who, after they got out of the military service, they moved downtown St. Paul area. And there's an interesting book called the Minnesota's Oldest Murder Mystery, because Sergeant John Hayes' body was found murdered along the near downtown St. Paul, and so it was a murder mystery. Who killed him? And Edward Phelan was charged with murder, and they had a trial, and he was acquitted. And then he left town and apparently was murdered on his way to California. But interesting little story about the Minnesota's oldest murder mystery. These guys were involved in the beginning of the building of the St. Paul Chapel. Another interesting guy that was involved in the building of the chapel was this guy named Count Augustin Arasti. Interesting guy. He had a steamboat, and he was living in this area, the Stillwater area. And so the story goes that he was downtown St. Paul in 1840, and he got stuck in a blizzard. So he was hanging out with these French Canadians, and they were playing poker, playing cards. And then, they told him what they were up to, and he said, "Well, I'll give you some slabs." He says, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you a bunch of slabs for the roof." And this is what slabs look like. He says, "All you guys got to do," he says, I'll even have my steamboat," because he had a steamboat on the St. Croix River. He says, "You guys come out there, just give me a couple guys to work the steamboat and help me haul them down and unload them and load them up." He says, "I'll donate the slabs for the roof." And so Isaac Labissoniere and this guy named Ralph Lescart volunteered. They went to Stillwater and they helped him load the slabs up when they took the steamboat, and they came down to St. Paul, and that's where the slabs came from for the chapel. Now he ended up moving to California and started a winery in California. It's called Buena Vista Winery, and it still exists today. And some people call him the pioneer of the wine industry in California. But he was one of the guys who would help contribute to the building of the St. Paul Chapel. Yeah.
I'm sure you probably know this, but prior to coming to this area in California, he started what's now called the Wallersheim Winery in Sauk City, Wisconsin.
He was also playing around with hops too. He was real
Yeah.
interested in that.
And he was frozen out there and moved west.
Yeah, but he contributed to this little St. Paul chapel. And as I said, Isaac and Raphael Lescart agreed to work on his steamboat, and they helped him haul these slabs up. So they had these slabs for the chapel. Another guy who helped with the chapel was Charles Rousseau. Now he volunteered his land up on the bluffs for the chapel, but Gaultier didn't want it there. And I'm not sure what else he did. I know he did. He supposedly was a contributor, and he was part of the initial planning committee for the chapel. He was a builder. Charles Rousseau helped build the Sibley House that's still standing today. He helped build the John Stevens House, which is still standing today on Hiawatha Park or Minnehaha Park. And he built the Ard Godfrey House, which is still standing over by Minneapolis, by Our Lady of Lourdes Church. He was a builder. He was involved in a lot of building in early Minnesota. Another guy who contributed to the building of the chapel was Antoine Pepin. He was a blacksmith at Fort Snelling. He supposedly provided the hinges and the lock for the door of the chapel. And then there's Abraham Perry, or Perry, it's known as Perry. There's a place called Perry Park in Arden Hills, which is right where I live. And that's named after Charles Perry, who was Abraham Perry's son. Abraham Perry made a huge contribution to the early settlement of Minnesota because he had like 5 or 6 daughters, and they all married into early practices. And he had an interesting life. He was born in Paris, moved to Switzerland, supposedly to get away from being recruited into the Napoleon's army. Got caught up in the recruitment at the Selkirk colony, so he moved to Fort Douglas Red River Settlement, and then he moved again to German Creek. He started in Fort Douglas, moved to German Creek. Then he moved to Pembina again, with his family. And then he got tired of that, and he came by ox cart down to Fort Snelling, and he settled at the reservation. But then he got evicted from the reservation and went to the Fountain Cave area where he started another farm, but he got evicted from there. And he ended up downtown St. Paul. And he, supposedly he helped out in some way in the building of the chapel. Another guy who helped out with the chapel was Joseph Rondo, Rondeau. And there's a neighborhood in St. Paul called the Rondo neighborhood, and that's named after this guy. He provided tamarack logs for the chapel. He was one of the early contributors. He ended up moving away from here, and he died in Crookston, Minnesota, later on in 1800. He was a fur trader, like a lot of the early men. Franklin Steele, he was an entrepreneur, became a very rich man, was involved in a lot of things. He donated the glass for the window in the chapel, so he's considered one of the contributors for the chapel. Here's a picture. This is actually a daguerreotype of the chapel. This is the real McCoy. You're looking at the real thing. This is the chapel in 1855, 56. We don't know for sure, but the drugstore in the back wasn't built supposedly until 1854, 1855. So, but this is the actual chapel. The chapel kind of captured the imagination of people, and that's part of its legacy. A lot of people. I've got 6 paintings here of the chapel, but there's actually a number more. There's a lot of people that decided it captured people's imaginations, and we have a lot of really interesting pictures of the chapel. And supposedly there was an addition built to the chapel. This is a photo that I found in the archives of the Archdiocese, showing that their depiction of what the addition looked like, because after 1847 they wanted to have a bigger building, so they added on to the chapel. And this is what I think is one of the most interesting pictures of St. Paul that I've ever seen. And it was made by a guy named Henry Lewis, it's a lithograph, made in 1849. So we know the chapel was there in 1849. So it is my firm belief that this building right here, the one with the addition, I think that's the chapel. Don't know for sure, but it's in the right location, the right spot. I know the chapel had an addition. So I think that's it. And that's what St. Paul looked like in 1849. Not, don't know for sure. It's a speculation, but it's a good guess. So let's talk about the legacy of this little chapel, St. Paul. It was dedicated on November 1st, 1841, which is the Feast of All Saints Days. Lucien Gaultier wrote the following, or he said the following at the dedication. He said, in 1841, and on the month of October, on the adjoining ground given to me by Mr. Gervais and Vital, I caused some logs to be cut and put up. And soon after, a poor church of logs and fitted so as to remind the stable of Bethlehem was built. Now, the nucleus of St. Paul was born. So this little chapel, he's claiming in 1841 it's going to be the nucleus of St. Paul. Well, 10 years later, they decide that there's enough people now. People keep coming to Minnesota. There's more and more Catholics coming to Minnesota. So the church decides we're going to make Minnesota a new diocese. So they appoint a bishop. His name is Joseph Creighton. Ever heard the name before? And Creighton arrives at the cathedral on July 2nd. He arrives at the chapel on July 2nd, 1851. And on that day, this little chapel, this humble little chapel, tiny little chapel, becomes a cathedral, the first cathedral in Minnesota. It's the first cathedral because after Creighton arrives, it's kind of a small little log place. They need more room, so they build a second cathedral. This is the second St. Paul Cathedral. But that wasn't big enough, so they needed another cathedral. So this is the third St. Paul Cathedral.
Are these all in the same spot or different places?
Different spots. These are the second and the third are both downtown area, kind of near where the little log chapel was. And then in 1907, they decide they need a bigger cathedral on top of the hill. And they laid the cornerstone for the fourth St. Paul Cathedral, which is the one that exists today. And the only guy left who had built the first cathedral, this little chapel of St. Paul, was Isaac Labissoniere. And there's his picture. And they laid the cornerstone for the fourth St. Paul Cathedral. And of course, we all know what the fourth St. Paul Cathedral looks like. But the little chapel was the first one. So then after they moved out of the little chapel because they built a bigger cathedral, well, now this building is sitting empty, so they figured, well, let's make a school out of it. So they make it a school. They call it St. Joseph Academy. The little log chapel, tiny little chapel, now becomes a school, Catholic school, St. Joseph Academy. Of course, there's a picture of St. Joseph Academy in later years. It grew a little bit. They kind of grew out of this little chapel, but it became a school. And a lot of the first pioneers' children went to the school, such as the wife of James J. Hill. She went to the chapel school. But then they decided they needed more room for a schoolhouse, so they built another bigger building for the school. And then in 1853, they had the cholera outbreak. Now the chapel was sitting empty at this time, and they need a place for a hospital. So guess what? We got this chapel sitting empty. We're going to make a hospital out of it. And so this tiny little chapel of St. Paul becomes the first hospital in Minnesota. Basically, it's the first hospital in Minnesota. They call it the St. Joseph's Hospital. And if you walk into the entryway of the St. Joseph Hospital, which is in the process of being, I think, it's going bye-bye, but the chapel, they have a picture of the chapel there. It was the first hospital in Minnesota. And then, of course, and there was a little battle going on, but it became the name of the city. They decided to call this municipality, this area where the chapel was, St. Paul. It became the name of the city. And of course, we know that not only did it become the name of the city, but it eventually became the capital of the state. So this tiny little chapel, built in 7 days by these 8 men, became the first Catholic, one of the first Catholic churches, became the first cathedral, became the first Catholic school, became the first hospital, became the name of the town, and eventually the name of the capital of our state of Minnesota. And there's a memorial now that gives homage to this little chapel. This is on Kellogg Bluffs, Kellogg Boulevard. It's on Kellogg and Minnesota, intersection of Kellogg and Minnesota. Kind of looking at it from the the top. They have a little fountain there, and they have that little thing in the middle is where they have the names of the builders and the acts, and a little dedication to this little chapel that was the beginning of the city of St. Paul. And here's a big rock they have kind of supposedly at the site where the actual chapel stood in the early days, overlooking the bluffs. It's a beautiful, beautiful location. They have a picture of Lucent, of Father Gaultier on the rock. And on the memorial, they have as follows, it reads as follows. It says, in 1841, and in the month of October, I caused some logs to be cut, prepared and put up as soon after a poor church of logs, and fitted so as to remind one of the stable of Bethlehem was built. Now the nucleus of St. Paul was formed. This church remained dedicated to St. Paul, and I expressed the wish to call the place by no other name, and he got his wish. St. Paul did have a beginning. In the beginning, there was a chapel. And there's we have a book on the,
Put it up on our
kind of
website
summarizes
tomorrow
what I said in the
afternoon.
back. If you want to buy a book on the
Yeah, tomorrow
chapel,
afternoon.
sell it for $15. The proceeds all go to our foundation. And like, there's a couple other books back there if you're interested. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. Do you have time for a few questions?
Right, absolutely. Anybody wants to? Anybody has any questions?
Check our chat.
Very good.
You have a picture of St. John's Cemetery out in Little Canada with some of the
Yes.
French
Tombstones?
tombstones. What's the story of St. John's? Because I think there are quite a few French tombstones there.
Yeah, it was originally called New Canada. And, you know, and people like Joseph and Labissoniere, you know, they had this cholera outbreak. I mean, he had 9 children, only 3 lived adulthood. Because, you know, I think the problem with downtown St. Paul was that the water wasn't very good there. Originally, he was down in the lowlands, you know, and again, he had water problems and it was flooded too much, so he moved downtown. And then they had a cholera outbreak. I mean, the water wasn't good. They didn't have good sewer systems. So then a lot of the French Canadians moved out. They got away from that area. They moved a lot of them went to Little Canada area and Osseo, you know, like Labissoniere went to Lake Como. They tried to get where it's healthier and there's better water supply. But you know, a lot of kids died with sanitation. And as more and more people came, you know, it became more and more difficult to stay healthy. So they kept moving out. But a lot of the French Canadians went to that area. You know, and I think that happened with a lot of immigrant groups. You go to where the people were speaking their same tongue, right? So the French Canadians come, they all go to the same where the other French Canadians were, they speak the same language. And the Germans all would stay together, and the Irish would stay together. And they, you know, that was probably a pretty normal thing. Scandinavian, the Swedes would stay, the Swedish people would stay together, the Norwegians would stay together, and they did not mix. But that's cool.
And Louis King of France is the same idea?
Well, yeah, they were part of the, you know, they had a church downtown, the St. Paul Chapel, and it became a cathedral. But as more and more Irish came in there, the Irish and the French, you know, there was a conflict about what language they're going to use, right? So the French Canadians decided to start their own church, they could have their own language. And the St. Paul Cathedral became more Irish, you know, because more hymns in English, speaking in English through the church. That was pretty common. Also became a French Canadian community. You know, there were little places where the French Canadians went. You know, there were little. I think the Irish kind of stayed in St. Paul for the most part, but you know, it would be immigrant groups that kind of stay together at the beginning. Frogtown, yes, yeah. Supposedly it was because of the friendship. I don't think there's a lot of friendship. They went out to Canada, Centerville, Osseo, Dayton, Campbell, and they went out to the.
I just wondered if that was how it got its name. Its nickname.
There's some theories on where Frogtown comes from. One is that there's a lot of frogs in the swamp. The other one is that there were French there. There's what's in the Farm Avenue.
I like this one.
I'm not sure they really know that for sure. where the name comes from.
We have a few questions from the chat. Kathy would like to know, what year was the third chapel built? That you showed.
1858. So the second cathedral was built in 1851. I don't have the date of the third.
1858, okay. And
They
then,
started building in 1907, and the fourth cathedral was done in 1950.
What year did we become a state?
53.
1858.
I'm sure everybody knows what we, but.
And then a second question from Kathy is, what was the relationship between the cathedral and Assumption Catholic Church, both in downtown St. Paul?
Good question.
Yeah.
Assumption was more of a German parish, is my understanding. There was a German-speaking German immigrants that started that church. You know, again, the immigrants would kind of stay together. But that's my understanding, is that the German Catholics were associated with Assumption at the beginning. The French Canadians were the St. Louis King of France, and then the Irish were more the cathedral. You know, they had Ireland was a Irish bishop after Crete. Crete was French, but Ireland was Irish.
And then Kathleen Stein-Smith says, "Merci, Mark, what a wonderful and inspirational talk." Other questions?
In Alexander Ross's history of the Selkirk settlement, 1856 or so, he talks about the cattle purchase that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk.
That cattle drive?
Yeah, and but he doesn't really discuss the out migration from the Selkirk settlement to St. Paul in detail. And I'm curious to know whether, since in the 1870s, the majority of the population of St. Paul was still speaking French, were the original Selkirk immigrants who came down from what's not primarily French-speaking Métis, or were they, because the Selkirk settlement was Scottish?
Well, and also Swiss,
Yes,
French Canadian.
because they had, that's right. they had
Because the Swiss, most of the Swiss who came from Switzerland, and there were a large group of them. Abraham Pierre was one of them. Most of them spoke French.
So they were mainly French-speaking people that came down from the Selkirk.
I would say probably the majority, but there were Scottish people who came down too. Pepin Graham, there were a number of Scottish people. You know, John Campbell, but you know, a lot of them could speak French too.
Mhm.
You know, simply spoke French. You know, most of the French was a common tongue back then.
Any questions? Well, Mark has, of course, books in the back, so see him if you're interested in that. And a couple of you have nicely asked about the recording. It should be available tomorrow afternoon on our website under the events tab, and I'll say events recording. So check that out. So again, thanks, Mark. Thank you.